Hello, and welcome to my feedback to your first group discussion of topics in our Information and Intelligence course. And I'm just going to start by sorting out a few logistical things. I think that you had some concerns about timing of those Hangouts. 45 minutes is a guideline. Depending on where you are in a class, there are some groups that have 3 members, some groups that have 4 members, some groups that have 5 members. So obviously, in order to cover the topics and give everybody enough runtime, those submissions are going to vary from 35, 40 minutes to maybe the excess of an hour. So I am not particularly hung up on the length as much as you're touching on different topics as a group. And how you organize it, that's up to you. If you want to do it more of the organic discussion of bouncing ideas amongst one another, or if you do it based on a question, how you did. So you organized it in a very structured way. So you took a question or sub-questions and you went and elaborated on it. So that's fine too. So this is something that, it's totally up to you. The technical issues, I think you were able to work those out. And from what I understand, there are not as much the issue of directions, but just timing and making sure that you preset it and test it and it works for you. And the other thing is the noise, the ambient noise. I think that came out in several groups. Unfortunately, it's not the ideal platform. So you might be dealing with it. You might want to play with it to turn off some things and see if it changes. It wasn't necessarily a big problem in your group. I think Kristen had a little bit of the interference where you took your headphones off. So that's, as far as the introduction. So thank you for your Hangout. Luis was, yes, he was unable to join. So hopefully he's going to be on your second one and you get to know him and his voice. And so I'm just going to go and hit a few things that your group discussed and sort of give you my assessment on it. So you started with Kristen, who was a trooper because she was on annual training using a hotspot. So thank you for being able to make it work from adverse conditions. And you started with definitions of intelligence and intelligence process, and Socrates told us that in order to talk about anything, we have to start with a definition. So thank you for that. And you talked about the altered balance of security and liberty in a new era of homeland security. Obviously, we are talking post 9/11, and we're talking about the shift. In a way, we look at those processes internally from the internal security standpoint. And of course, I think Gary might have mentioned that during your discussion that we really, American citizens, really could care less what happens in the foreign intelligence gathering. We are not particularly sympathetic to what we do on other nations or to other peoples. But when it comes to the backyard, we are extremely concerned because, this is the government that's supposed to work for us. So that same government we expect to be transparent. So when you go into the issues of secrecy, then the American public is starting to have issues with it. And the local community intelligence gathering is controversial. And you discussed, and I think, Kristen, you were focused on saying that, new times call for new measures. And when we develop trust with the public, when people know why a certain collection has to happen, when there is proper oversight, then of course we fare much better with that, reluctance or people not being as willing to sacrifice some of their privacies or some of their civil liberties. But then, of course, you also talked about, and I thought that was very, very brilliant that you brought it up. You talked about the collection disciplines and, human being huge in foreign tradecraft, and you talked about the open source intelligence. And it's excellent because I think that open source intelligence has been, and when you read Loventhal, he makes several comments about that, has been that ignored part of a collection discipline, just because you did not, by virtue of its definition, the intelligence is something that gets obtained clandestinely and in a secretive way. So when you look at the open source intelligence, which has been used, since the beginning of the American intelligence community, has been quite, good collection discipline. It still is not the same as the spycraft, as the human intelligence, as having assets, as having access to assets. So again, perhaps the focus on how we leverage the open source intelligence at the local level and community level deserves some highlight as well, to where we don't run into the issues that Gary brought about, and I think it's a very relevant issue, is yes, logically and organizationally, and from the standpoint of the fact that all incidents start at the local level. So, the big terrorist event is not going to happen, at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, although it may. It's just going to happen in a local American community, be it business community, rural community, World Trade Center was certainly a certain business community. And so it will require immediate responses of that local community, but it also, that local community might be the best eyes and ears. And so that's where the best connecting of dots might happen. And that's where, all the alerts or warnings or things that are atypical happen. And so, those people, I don't know if you mentioned that terrorists have to go grocery shopping, and, they do drive cars, they load and unload, they buy SIM cards, they do things. And they, that happens at some point at the community level. So, so the local law enforcement is that natural first layer of being aware to the information that's out there and to be the collector of that information. And, we have a concept of intelligence-led policing that came out of the UK. And that's the model of more of a homeland security-ish role of law enforcement. But in the same vein, you have local law enforcement that has built trust with the community for providing for safety. And that trust is a very important thing at that community level. So when you have structures that are federal that come to bear, then, or if you assign the role of that, informer creator, police officer, as creating a vast network of informers or assets, now that changes the playing field a little bit, because, typically in law enforcement, and we've got that, strong criminal aspect of, whether FBI traditionally as an agency or, local law enforcement, you have confidential informers. Well, they're motivated to provide, be informers because of criminal investigations and usually the plea bargains that they do. And usually they are not the best people, and they are not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. The confidential informers are in a certain category. Assets in intelligence are totally different. Assets in foreign intelligence usually work from some kind of intrinsic motivation, or the motivation because they hate their government in their country and they want to help the U.S., or because they expect to, get visas and, be accepted as refugees, or, whatever other range of factors that not necessarily related to criminal activity. So that's how we build assets, you know, for foreign intelligence. We appeal to their hearts and minds and so on and so forth. And those are typically not our citizens. And now we are dealing with local law enforcement and community policing that you talked about. And how do you build a network of informers that suddenly problematic? How is law enforcement trained for that? You know, how do you change the mindset, and how do you provide for good models for that? And you know, of course, again, a lot of times when you look at the intelligence cycle, you know, there's collectors, and then on the front end of it is policy and the requirements, and not always the collector will know what the purpose of the requirement is, and the person that analyzes might not know much about, you know, the collection process. So, you know, if you look in a classical sense of that intelligence cycle, the police officer might not always know to what end they are asking certain questions. And if they don't, then again, there is a threat that that information can be used not really for the benefit of its community, and that community is really tightly coupled with the existence of a law enforcement agency at the local level. So we've got federalism and, you know, and local, and that, you know, Jeffersonian-Hamilton dilemma also that works itself through. Gary mentioned, you know, with respect to would the Navy officer be a good person to do domestic intelligence, and you know, you said, yeah, well, of course not, because there's a whole set of laws that forbid that. And this is the whole set of laws where, you know, military cannot force evacuations, for example, in disaster in the United States, you know, because there are laws like policy comitatus and things like that. So that's a valid point. And I think that the point that Dahl was trying to make on that was that the requirements of the internal intelligence, those requirements perhaps are different, and those processes might be a little bit different than for the foreign intelligence, you know, where, you know, military was definitely a very strong partner in that. So how is that new structure for intelligence collection look? You know, is it more based on a military model? Is it more based on community policing, intelligence-led policing? You know, or is it a combination of many different things? And so you had a good conversation on that. And I think that, you know, you mentioned Patriot Act and the wiretaps and the, not sure if you talked about the FISA court, you know, the increased proliferation of those national security letters and what they do at the local level. That's, you know, really interesting dynamic as well. Gary, I think Kristen also you talked about the City of Houston crime analysis and how you don't really have to violate that privacy with a lot of that private information that's in the public domain. But at the same time, there are issues as far as information sharing about those different levels of law enforcement, you know, from local, state, all the way to federal. And you had a very good discussion on security clearances. And I think Trevorton, you know, teases it out as well, and talking about how, you know, at that local level, we need that local intelligence or information that's going to become intelligence. And so we create those fusion centers and task forces, and a lot of people on those do not have a need to know, or they don't have appropriate levels. So a lot of stuff goes up, but then what comes down, it's problematic to the local law enforcement. And I think you had a really great example on how a law enforcement community works a little bit different than an intelligence community. In law enforcement community, if you're a peace officer in Texas, or even if you are in Louisiana or, you know, Mississippi, you can access NCIC, which is National Criminal Information Database. Somebody from, you know, can call you if they're a sheriff in, you know, in Louisiana, and they're looking for somebody, you know, through the Louisiana criminal system, we can access the Texas Criminal Information Database. And, we can do that information sharing a little bit easier among the local and state law enforcement. You're just a peace officer and you're a peace officer, that's it. Every peace officer in the state of Texas has the same powers of arrest. Whereas when you get into the intelligence agencies and the community, the IC, and yes, IC community is redundant, Gary. So when you get into those members, there have different threshold for different classifications, and the classification will be different in DOD, and it's going to be different at the DOJ, and it's going to be different, among different agencies. So I think the classification system is also one that's very, perhaps it needs reform. And if you listen to General McChrystal, who wrote an excellent book on the Team of Teams, I believe is the title, by General McChrystal, he talks about the issue of all those, of this really nightmare of different classification processes and for different agencies. But you're right, so it takes you months to get that security clearance. So that is definitely an issue when you bring down those actors and try to integrate them with local law enforcement. I know for certain that in fusion centers, agencies, law enforcement agencies in Texas are refusing to send their officers to those fusion centers because the return on their investment is very little, because those officers are there and they are contributing and they are bringing and information to the fusion center, but they are often not included in all those different ad hoc groups and discussions, and they only have bits and pieces of information available to them. So for the local jurisdiction, they say, this is just not worth our investment. Typically, the assignment to the fusion center is borne by the agency that sends from the local law enforcement that sends somebody over there. So again, those are the issues that definitely are problematic when we are thinking about that local level. So clearances, yes, a big issue, and a nice discussion in Trevorton on that as well, and that's a dated discussion already anyway. The involvement of the military, what kind of model of intelligence do we have for domestic intelligence? I think, a lot of it has to do the distaste, maybe public distaste for domestic intelligence, or concept of it, goes back to certain experiences or historical experiences nations had with that. A perfect example, and is from France during the time of the Big French Revolution. I love that example because it really illustrates how slippery that slope is. And Kristen, I just loved the poem that you brought at the end, Walt Whitman's poem, and this is exactly what I'm talking about with France. If you recall, France was the country that did not want the king anymore and off with his head, and they had this, great idea of liberty, fraternity, and solidarity, and spearheaded those ideas of, people being equal, not very much different than from our Declaration of Independence, and so they abolished the monarchy. And then they had no political structure for what to do with that mess. They had a revolution and they had nothing to really go by. It didn't come with an instruction book. So, of course, they had to make sure that the revolution spirit survives. And they created the Department of Public Safety. And that public safety with, Danton was one of the key players, and Robespierre was definitely the biggest idealist of the French Revolution. And they institute the law of suspects. So, that law of suspects was what created the first state of terrorist state, which was France during the French Republic, during the French Revolution, where they started guillotining people on one-day court trials, people that were accused of not liking the revolution, expressing their discontent for the revolution, having different opinion than, the people that were for the revolution. And of course, that expanded to terror and mass executions of anybody that was not supportive of this, ideal new order of things, and that came out from ideology that was rooted in equality, solidarity, and fraternity. Came from Robespierre was a great thinker of the revolution, and the biggest murderer of it. And so how it starts, it could be very innocuous, it could be very idealistic. And I think we are very cognizant of that. The Russian experience in 1917 with Russian Revolution and NKVD, an internal security apparatus in Russia, is yet another example. And, Iran during the Shah, Pahlavi and the Savak also had those internal security services, and I think we do know what happens when the pendulum swings too far. So that was my digression on that slippery slope, and I think reflected in that poem that Kristen brought at the end. And the last thing another thing you talk about is, how do you assess the investment in intelligence or bringing outcomes? And the real difficulty with measuring prevention or measuring things that didn't happen, it's much easier for us to look at the fiascos and do post-mortem of something that went wrong, but how the things that don't materialize, and definitely with intelligence, this is that secretive area, how do you assess that, and who assesses it? How is just going to depend, I guess, where you stand, whether you're part of a private business, whether you're part of a public safety agency, or whether you are, a regular citizen. And definitely we need more research on some matrix, or even if it's just perception data, or if it's, anything that will help us gauge those investments. And, then, of course, you have people looking at studies like, you red teamed TSA, and suddenly it turns out that 80% of the carry-on luggage is, not properly screened. And you're thinking about, we created that behemoth in post 9/11 Transportation Security Administration, and are we getting enough for the, sacrificing our security, or is it just for the feeling of security or the appearance of security? And I think that might have come out in your conversation as well. And last but not least, Christine had a really long back and forth on assessing the civil liberties versus security and finding a balance. And I think perhaps the cockpit door is a very good example on some measurable things that we can do as far as hazard mitigation, and then some realistic expectations, perhaps that we are living in a certain times with a certain threat, and perhaps we can't prevent the threat from happening. And perhaps the focus could be on building a resilience on that awareness, or knowing what to do when the unavoidable happens. And that I don't think we are there yet. We are, in my view, not prepared for mass casualty events in the United States. We are yet to have a first suicide bomber hit an American mall. And it would be very interesting to see how emotionally we can deal with an event like that, and how it's going to move, again, the discourse on security and civil liberties. But we are not where Israel is, for example, and they, built resilience by, cleaning up their crime scenes within an hour, by having, citizen education on civil defense education, very, very progressed. And do we want that in the United States? And that's a big question. Uh, but yes, for certain things, that have not happened, we do not have. Can we prevent them? I propose to you to think about the Boston Marathon bombing because many people talk about the great response to Boston Marathon bombing and great role of the FBI in the intelligence gathering, and I think this is a very good illustration of a difference between that preemptive, as Gary talked, intelligence gathering and assets measures and things like that, and what you do in criminal investigations, in which FBI has been traditionally so wonderful and has a proper mechanism and mindset for. And in Boston Marathon bombing, if you think about it, it's the event happened, and it happened in spite of the intelligence, both by the Russian security apparatus that they had on Tsarnaev, on Tamerlan Tsarnaev, and in spite of the fact that FBI had contact with Tsarnaev. And still, there are certain constraints that, even though that, those dots were there, there is no mechanism to truly prevent that event from happening within our laws. And I think that's a big discussion about the laws. And then, of course, Boston Marathon bombing had two issues: domestic terrorism and foreign national, because, one brother was American citizen, one brother was not American citizen. There were a lot of issues with the one that was the American citizen, with the due process and stuff like that. But how you disentangle those are becoming very complex. But the FBI did a great job in investigations and in the follow-up, and that was a total suspension of civil liberties. Boston was on lockdown. How do American cities go on lockdown? And it was totally voluntary. So in those moments, the citizens are willing to forgo, like you said, that compliance is pretty high in the aftermath of the event. There were people going door to door. That particular household that had a boat in a yard, they called in. So it wasn't that the law enforcement detected that their helicopter with a FLIR capability confirmed that there was somebody in that boat, but it came from the citizen. So was that a very effective intelligence gathering prior to event? How much of that really actually came from the things we haven't spent money on? We spend money on that FLIR helicopter, but it was a citizen that called in. If there were citizens that called in with camera feeds to the FBI. So that is that sort of circuitous way to get back to that question. Are we getting enough out of that intelligence, or would we have proper mechanisms in spite of intelligence processes? People. Education and resilience building could be another way to go. But so food for thought. And Christine, sorry, you had very interesting set of arguments for. I think at some point Gary called you on it. So do you agree with Benjamin Franklin or not? What? And I think that this is what we are watching. We're watching that balance. And in the last example, I think that's one of my favorites is during the Ebola Gate, 2014, 15, whenever it was, we had a case of a nurse that came from the Ebola country. I believe it might have been Nigeria, and she was quarantined upon arrival to the country, and then she was mandated to have a 21-day obligatory house quarantine or house arrest to see if she would develop symptoms. Now the case became a poster child for discussion on security and civil liberties, and people were talking about her right as a citizen to go out and have a regular life if she's not sick. obviously, she doesn't have symptoms. She doesn't have a fever. She's not contagious, and she's not contagious. And she is a professional who has worked with that virus, so she knows how to assess and self-monitor. And if she doesn't have symptoms, she's not sick, then she is a healthy American citizen who has all the rights of the American citizen. And then, of course, on the other hand, there were all those who said, well, but she is a probable threat. The situation could change. She could become contagious. What if she does not catch it? And we are better safe, for the common good, because if she does become, the source, then we won't be able to track the disease. And for the common good, she needs to be contained. Well, it was easy for advocates of common good to talk about somebody else's civil liberties, right? But for that nurse, her civil liberties were violated. And then there was an issue of, if she's supposed to be at home for 21 days and she doesn't want to be, who is going to enforce it? Because local law enforcement does not have a standing on how to enforce that. How to enforce somebody that says, I'm healthy and I'm going to go out, and there's nothing you can do about it because I am not engaging in any criminal activity. And so this is a perfect example of, of that balance. And the question that, I have for all of that is, what has been done on the front end? We've been talking about viruses and biological warfare, at least since 9/11. And the quarantine, forced, voluntary, or whatever else, has been on the fringe of the conversation, and we don't have a process for it. In Canada, it's SARS. And they did a ton of studies on how law enforcement did and how versus voluntary quarantine did. And their studies confirmed that a mandatory quarantine was ineffective for a variety of different reasons. So a growing body of evidence and empirical research on quarantine, and yet we are in the midst of a crisis discussing quarantine issue, and it's still not a resolved issue. So I think when we think about security, there are other ways that we can look at it, and civil liberties. A lot of times we use those civil liberties, common good, sort of as a blanket for lack of competence in integrating research and looking at, proactively on what else can we do on the other end. And so, this is a good case study. If you don't know the whole context of that, it's a good food for thought about our balance on civil liberties and security and protection, general protection of population. So I wanted to thank you for your participation, and I'm looking forward to your Google Hangout too.